What's up everyone, this is Ryan here and you are watching part 1 of my Room database and Android architecture components tutorial. So basically what we're going to be doing in this tutorial series is building a small, sort of decent looking application which uses a Room database alongside other parts of the Android architecture components to build all of this in sort of a Model-View-ViewModel style architecture. Now before I continue, there's a couple of things that I wanted to mention. So for starters, this is not intended to be a beginner tutorial. Unlike the tutorial which this application is actually based on, which is my Recycler-View 2017 full app tutorial, which is directed towards beginners, and I do expect you to complete that before you get here, because the thing about this tutorial is there's a lot of stuff I'm not going to be explaining in as much detail as I normally would if I was teaching beginners. I'm going to be assuming that I am teaching sort of junior to intermediate level developers who already have the basics of the Android framework mastered. Now I will of course be going into detail on the various new APIs that we'll be using, but just for the general stuff, I'm not really going to explain the basics, and we're not going to be building the layouts sort of live. And the reason for that is it takes a really long time, and if you want to see lots of footage of me building layouts and explaining the basics of sort of material design and that stuff, again, you're going to want to check the Recycler-View 2017 application and series. So that's basically that. Let's move on to a demo of the application. So basically what the app looks like is this here. We have a list activity, and it contains a list of list items, and we can add new list items. And this pops up a new activity called create activity. And in this create activity, what we can do is select a different drawable or a color if we like, and then we can include a message. This is a message, and all that really does is it creates a new list item, like so. We can also swipe to delete list items, although I haven't really implemented the undo swipe to delete sort of feature that was implemented in the other tutorial, but we can just swipe that away. And the last piece of this application is the detail view or detail activity. So when I click on a particular item, as you can see, it displays a detailed view of the item, including the message, the time that the item was created, and also the drawable which was selected in the previous part. And of course it animates, as you can see here. So that's sort of that is basically what the application is. Obviously it's not meant to look amazing or be very expansive in terms of features, but really what I was just trying to do is let's create sort of a basic note-taking application with good separation of concerns that uses Model-View-ViewModel and Android architecture components. So speaking of Model-View-ViewModel, I'm going to now give you a sort of general overview of the architecture. Now, here we have an obligatory low-budget wise-ass architecture diagram here, but basically this is how it works. Now, I really have to stress two important things. Number one, one difficulty I had with researching and building this project is that Model-View-ViewModel is not actually a super well-defined sort of architecture pattern. I will kind of give my own definition and an explanation of it based on my sources, but please be aware that there are so many different ways to implement this pattern, and just because I like to have a one-to-one ratio of activities to fragments doesn't mean you have to do that. But what I will kind of show you is a very separated style architecture that I like to use, and hopefully you can kind of work it into whatever is your own preferred architecture. So anyways, moving on. How I normally do things, and this is in Model-View Presenter or whatever I'm working with, is I treat the activity simply like a container for the fragment, so I don't put any view logic in the activity. The fragment itself becomes the view, and in our Model-View Presenter, so all of my sort of user interface logic goes in there. Now, a very key feature of the Model-View-ViewModel pattern is that while the fragment can talk to the view model directly, the view model must not contain a reference or a dependency on any view. Rather, what it does is it exposes streams of data by way of observables, or in this case LiveData, which is essentially a kind of observable model, it will expose these live data objects to the fragment, and the fragment will listen to changes of those objects. But really, the key thing I want to mention here is that while the fragment can and does depend directly on the view model, the view model itself cannot depend on any specific view. And that is really the fundamental difference between, say, model view presenter or model view view model, is that little sort of observer relationship here, which I like to call it. Down below, we also have a repository. So naturally, the view model is going to be talking to a repository object, and the purpose of this repository is to sort of abstract the database from the view model, so we don't have a situation where the view model is talking sort of directly to our room stuff. So we do want that layer of abstraction in there. And the repository, it's kind of neat. It actually just depends directly on the data access object. So while it doesn't really know anything about the room database directly, it does know about the data access object within the room database, and that's sort of how it will be accessing and retrieving and creating records within the database. So all of this stuff will make a lot more sense when we get into the code, but as always, I like to give a rough overview of the architecture just so you kind of can have some sort of visual setup for understanding the application. The last thing I'll mention before we get to some housekeeping stuff is that I'll just briefly mention the APIs that we'll be using. So for the database, we're going to be using, of course, Room. We'll be using LiveData to expose and manage data streams. LiveData is part of Android architecture components, and it's sort of a life cycle aware observable class. ViewModel is again sort of the primary class which we'll be using to sort of it basically becomes what the presenter or controller is in a sense in other architectures, and we're going to be using the actual ViewModel class from Android architecture components. Why? Because it's set up so that we can basically have it persist through orientation changes. Again, if you're not super clear on that, we'll go over all this stuff in the tutorial. I have decided to include Dagger 2, and we'll be using ViewModelProvider.factory to sort of set up the dependency management of our view models and the repository. Although, to be perfectly honest, I did not want to create a very expansive and complicated Dagger 2 setup because I don't really want anything that I can't explain simply. And while you could definitely approach Dagger 2 sort of more head-on in this project, I really just wanted to keep it simple. So we'll go over the basics of that. And of course, we have View Pager Indicator by Jake Wharton for this little neat thing down here. And for the circular image views within the list items, we are using the Circle Image View library by Henning Dodenhoff. So that's basically it for the APIs, the architecture, and a general overview of the project. And we'll finish this video off with a little bit of housekeeping. Alright, 2 more things and then we are finished. So number 1, as always, the repository for this project is available down in the description box below. A big reason why I do these big projects and go through the trouble of setting up all the GitHub repositories and what have you is so that I can have sort of some kind of a peer review process where experienced developers can kind of school my ass on things which are either flat out wrong or suboptimal. So if there's anything you see in this application specifically to do with the implementation of Android architecture components and Model-View-ViewModel, like, just bear in mind that I'm not trying to build the entire application 100% perfectly, just the things that this tutorial is related to, then please do open an issue in GitHub or shoot me a message or something like that and school me on whatever it is that you think could be improved. I really treat people the same way they treat me, so if you're respectful with me, I will try and be respectful with you. So that's that, and the last thing I wanted to mention is that if this content is useful to you and possibly you might like to see me do this kind of thing full time, then please do consider checking out the options down in the pinned comment below to support my efforts. I have a Patreon account set up, and also there's a few other methods, and I would like nothing more than to create stuff like this full time. So thank you so much for watching, thank you for your support, and hopefully you enjoy the following content. Peace out.